So our next presentation will be on the 2020 seagrass mapping study, the results for the Charlotte Harbor Estuaries area. Mr. Mark Walton will be providing this presentation. Next slide. The purpose of this is to provide information on how the Southwest Florida Water Management District is collecting aerial photography data for seagrass coverage estimates, as well as presenting the results for the Charlotte Harbor and Lemon Bay estuaries. This relates to water quality improvement and fish, wildlife, and habitat protection priority areas in the CCMP. So with that, Mark, whenever you're ready.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Apologize for the croaky voice today, but as Devin mentioned, I'm filling in for Chris Anastasiou today, who's our chief scientist and heads our seagrass mapping program. But as you can see by the names and sort of emblems up there on the page, it's a comprehensive effort that involves a lot of different partner organizations and also partner agencies. Next slide, please. So this is what we believe is one of the most comprehensive seagrass mapping programs in the world. You can see by the coloured cells the spatial extent of the mapping program. Extends across both the Suncoast and the Springs Coast areas. The Suncoast mapping area covers over 2,500 square miles, extending from St. Joseph Sound and Clearwater Harbour down to Charlotte Harbour. Noting that Charlotte Harbour is shared between the Southwest Florida Water Management District and the South Florida Water Management District, and that split is just south of the Charlotte and Lee County line. We've been undertaking this. Well, before I say that, the Suncoast mapping we map every 2 years. So you can think about that as being both the summer and the winter Olympic years, this year notwithstanding. And the Springs Coast mapping extends north of St. Joseph Sound all the way up to Wakasasa Bay, and we do that every 4 years, so just the summer Olympics years. As I said, we've been doing this since 1988, so we have one of the longest continuous records of seagrass mapping that we know of for this size area, and really important data set to track those changes in estuary and coastal health. Next slide, please. So before we, I guess, launch into the results of what we've seen in the 2020 seagrass mapping, it's worth just going through what this program entails. So there's 3 phases to the seagrass mapping. There's the acquisition of the imagery, which takes place in a defined mapping window under quite strict environmental conditions. There's the photo interpretation, where we have specialized interpreters that actually look at the signature and define those patches of seagrass. And then there's field verification, where various quality checks and field verification visits are undertaken to ensure that the map production is aligned with what's happening out in the real world. So we'll go through those one by one. Next slide. So as I said, we've got a defined flight window for capturing imagery, and really, good mapping starts with good imagery. So we target the best possible conditions that we can get in terms of water and atmospheric clarity. So we have quite strict criteria on when flights can go up. We need to have clear skies, no cloud virtually. We need to have calm waters as well. So we're constantly monitoring wind, tides, water, rain, and we have a network of volunteers that go out each day during our flight window to various points within the estuary to monitor water clarity using Secchi discs. And and thank you to all those volunteers that do that. Once we collect the imagery, there's a lot of quality checks that go into that to make sure that it's registered accurately to the ground, or to the ground and to other imagery, and that spectrally it's suitable for drawing out seagrass signature. So it's important that the image we capture is very much spec'd out for this purpose, as opposed to other imagery collections over land or drone missions and so forth. Once we get the imagery in, it's checked for quality, and it's not uncommon for reflights to be needed to make sure we get the best possible conditions. The imagery itself often goes through significant post-processing to draw out that seagrass signature in terms of things like contrast stretching and creating color-balanced mosaics. Next slide, please. All right, so field verification. There's three elements to our field verification, and sort of skipping to this. In some ways, the back end of our mapping program. So three phases to making sure that our mapping is accurate and reflects what's happening in the real world. So we have photo interpreter ground truthing, quality control spot checks, which are often carried out by district staff and some of our partner agencies, and an independent accuracy assessment to check the actual accuracy of our maps. So we'll go through each of those one by one. All right, so the photo interpreter ground truthing is undertaken by the photo interpreters themselves throughout the mapping process to answer specific questions on the signatures they're seeing within the imagery, and essentially to calibrate those signatures to field conditions within the map. It's important to point out that the photo interpreters visit nearly 1,000 points throughout the estuaries. So when they actually return back to the computers to start to delineate seagrass units, they have a good idea of what they're looking at. They're not just looking at imagery; they're actually out in the real world, getting an idea of what's happening. The points are visited close to the time of acquisition, sometimes during acquisition, but mostly just after, so that they're seeing conditions as it is in the imagery. All the field verification, both the photo interpreter ground truth and other field verification elements, use a Survey 123 app so that we get consistent data and we minimize the time and errors associated with transcribing data. The PIs collect information on seagrass presence, species, substrate, and drift and attached algae, and this helps give them a good idea of what's happening ecologically in those areas, and they can get a better understanding of what those seagrass signatures in the imagery are telling them. An important point as well is video is collected at each point, and that's often reviewed later in the office to aid attribution, and that allows that they can get many eyes on that video and not be rushed to provide an assessment of what they're seeing in the field. So we can get lots of experts to look in and see what's happening in each of those, and that helps to improve the accuracy of the mapping. Next slide, please. All right. So the quality control spot checks, as I said, are often undertaken by district staff towards the end of the mapping cycle. At this point, we usually have draft maps in hand, and we're going out and checking areas that perhaps there's some questions about, or there's been noticed change since the last mapping cycle, or we've been informed that there's some issues in that area, and often we'll bring partner agencies along to draw on their expertise and their experience of being out on the water, seeing these areas for real. So in the last mapping cycle, district staff, for instance, visited the east wall with the aquatic preserve staff and the Matlacha Pass area with FWC. This data is also captured using the same template as the PI checks, and is made available to the PIs to fine tune the mapping. And next slide, please. Excuse me. Independent accuracy assessment. So this happens during and after acquisition, but generally while the maps have been developed. And the important point here is that this is done by a third organisation that is strictly not in contact with the mappers. So what we're trying to do here is to not bias the development of maps, but provide a data set that we can go back and review, whether the maps what maps are accurate for selected points. The accuracy is assessed using a random stratified design. So there's over 1,000 points that are spread out between different mapping units, and what we look for is seagrass presence and absence. So we look for areas with greater than 10% seagrass coverage, and see if the mapping predicts those areas in at least 90% of times that the field sites do. Next point, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, you got, yeah. So photo interpretation, it's important to realize that the photo interpreters are not necessarily mapping every seagrass blade. What they're looking at is a signature across a larger area, based on things like color, texture, patterns, and then translating those signatures to a modified flux convention. Next slide, please.
So Mark, just to let you know, you're having a little lag on your end, but the slides are advancing quicker on our end. So it's not a problem, but just know that they are advancing when you're telling our next slide.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, so these are our three main flux codes for our seagrass and attached algae mapping units. There are others, but these are the ones that we'll dwell on. So the continuous seagrass coverage 9116 is areas with a uniform signature of greater than 25% seagrass coverage, or more accurately, less than 25% of the area showing up as unvegetated. The patchy seagrass 9113 are discontinuous areas of greater than a quarter acre, and they can appear as singular isolated patches or extensive areas of sparse seagrass, less than 25%. And then we have attached algae 9121, that is areas of attached or persistent algae, usually Caulerpa species. What's important to know is we don't map drift algae. So what that means is if we map area that doesn't have seagrass in it, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing there. It could be bare sand, or it could have areas of drift algae through there as well. Next slide, please. All right, so important to note that when we look at some of these flux codes, there's a wide variety in how they can look. So seagrass, essentially, it's continuous and uniform signature. It can have small, less than a quarter acre patches of sandy bottom interspersed within the bed, but these are not dominant. But what's important is that it can cover quite a range of density, right? 25% right through to thick thalassia beds, nearly 100% coverage. And the other thing to note when we're looking at the signature is that we don't say anything about the quality of that seagrass. We're just looking at coverage, so you can see through those various four squares. It'd be anything from thick, healthy thalassia beds like we see on the top right, through to degraded epiphyte covered blades, through to more sparser areas, or even areas where there's less vigor in the seagrass growth. Next slide, please. Before I go to 9113, in terms of the varying quality of seagrass that is picked up in our mapping, it's important to note this is one data set, and there's other data sets. For instance, the transect data that the Aquatic Preserves capture, and the Eyes on Seagrass program that look a bit more at things like the quality of the seagrass and epiphyte coverage and so forth. And so important to note there's that we use these in conjunction with those other data sets. All right, again, patchy seagrass also covers quite a range there. It could be areas of quite classic rounded clumps of seagrass through to sparsely covered blades, through to areas that can be covered in areas of drift algae with seagrass coming in through the middle of them. Sorry, next slide, please. (9121), our attached algae class. This looks at pure stands of attached algae. So we're looking often Caulerpa in these areas. Down in Charlotte Harbour, in the last mapping cycle, we're looking mostly Caulerpa fastigiata, but also some Caulerpa proliferans. When there's co-dominance between Caulerpa and seagrass, the area is characterized by a seagrass cover type when it's more than 10% cover. Next slide, please. All right, with that, we move on to the results of what we found in 2020. So to give a regional perspective, there's been a decrease in seagrass across the board in all of our Suncoast estuary segments. Charlotte Harbour was our biggest decrease, but you can see that all of them decreased to some extent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the segments of Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbour, and we'll look at 2018 coverage, 2020 coverage, and then look at patterns of change between them. Next slide, please. All right, Lemon Bay. So in 2018, we'd seen a decrease in seagrass in Lemon Bay, particularly in the northern section. You can see by the chart on the right that we'd had solid growth in seagrass right up to 2016, and then we'd started to decrease in the 2018 mapping cycle. And so that was mostly concentrated up the north part of the bay. Next slide, please. In 2020, that loss accelerated and was also dispersed further around the bay, even in Donna and Roberts Bay up in the north. Next slide, please. And you can see that in the change map here, we have areas of change spread right throughout and up in the north as well. So all in all, we've lost approximately 347 acres of seagrass between 2018 and 2020, representing about 12% drop in seagrass coverage. But importantly, that's the lowest that we've seen since 1988. Next slide, please. In Charlotte Harbour, again, we'd seen some steady growth up to about 2014, and then we'd start to see a decrease in 2016. Next slide, please. In 2020, we've seen a marked drop in seagrass coverage compared to those previous years, and again, this is now the lowest since our mapping began. Next slide, please. That loss has been, there's loss throughout, but you can see clearly that loss is particularly concentrated along the Charlotte Harbour east wall in the northern part of that area, along the Peace and Mayaca rivers, and along the deep edge of the west wall. So in terms of why we're seeing that, it's that's I guess an ongoing question, but undoubtedly we're likely seeing some hangover effects here from red tide in 2017-18, even into early 2019, and also Hurricane Irma prior to that in 2017. What we had noted along the east wall was dense macroalgae coverage, and there's some sign that macroalgae has started to disperse somewhat. So there is perhaps potential for recovery there, but we'll have to see what happens with this ongoing red tide. But you can see looking down the change column there that there's greater than 50% change along the East Charlotte Harbour North Wall, and high numbers throughout some of those other areas. Next slide, please. All right, so I guess to sum up what is not great news for Lemon Bay. 2020 map seagrass acreage dropped to an all-time low, 2,500 acres, the lowest we're seeing since 1988. And between 2018 and 2020, Charlotte Harbour has lost approximately 23% of seagrass habitat, so over nearly 4,500 acres. Again, it's dropped to an all-time low, 15,000 acres, lowest we've seen since 1988. As we could see there, the greatest losses occurred along the northern section of the harbour's east wall, which has lost 1,770 acres, or 50% compared to the previous mapping cycle in 2018. So yeah, there's, as I mentioned, there's some anecdotal evidence of perhaps there may be some recovery in that area as macroalgae has moved on. But we do need to see what the impacts are going to be of this latest red tide event. Important to note that our next mapping cycle is already in planning. The window for the 22 seagrass mapping opens up at the end of this year. So we'll see what we find. Next slide, please. And again, shout out to all the partner agencies that help us in this endeavour in terms of providing their knowledge, expertise, and resources to help us track what's happening in these estuaries. Next slide. So the current seagrass maps are now available on the district's data portal. The address shown there. There has been in recent days a few issues with that server. So if you're having trouble accessing it, you can reach out to Chris Anastasiou, and he'll help you to get the data that you're after. And that's his contact details there. And with that, I guess, is there any questions?
I had a couple of questions. First of all, thank you, Mark. That was really interesting, and appreciate you taking the time to cover that for Dr. Anastasiou. So my questions, what resolution is the mapping being done at? And is that just RGB imagery, or are you doing multispectral?
Yep, so the image resolution is 1 foot imagery, I believe. It is four band imagery, and the minimum mapping units, in terms of delineating the actual polygons, are a 1/4 acre.
I have a question, if I may. Ernesto here.
Yes, Ernesto.
The question is, have you compared your data with the data that is being generated by Eyes on Seagrass? All that mapping and all that citizen activity. Have you ever had the chance to see that and compare to your? And in the same token, is there any way that the citizens can actually go on and access your data? I saw the last slide that you have. You have a website where it might be possible for citizens to go and see the data that you have.
Yeah, that's right, and that's available to the public. Maybe we can flick back to that,
Please do.
Previous slide to just leave that up for folks to screen capture.
Yeah.
That. But yeah, anyone can access that that page. As I said, if there's any issues, if you access, try and access it today, for instance, let us know. But yeah, that should be up and running if it's not already. In terms of the first part of your question with comparison to Eyes on Seagrass, yeah, we constantly look at other data sets and compare what's happening. Not just Eyes on Seagrass, but also things like the Transect data that the aquatic preserves staff collect. and also in the other estuaries, Sarasota and Tampa Bay, we look at their transect data as well, and we're seeing the same trends play out in those data sets as well. So there's broad agreement that there's been marked drops in seagrass coverage and significant increases in macroalgae through these systems.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mindy Brown with DEP Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves. Thank you, Mark, for presenting this data. And yeah, we do these seagrass fixed transect monitoring. And yeah, our data pretty much shows the seagrass loss that he's showing as well. And along our transect monitoring, you can see the loss of abundance by species. And so somewhere on our transects along the east wall, you can see that there was a considerable loss of Thalassia from the smothering of that macroalgae that Mark was describing. So yeah, maybe we'll see some species shifts. Maybe Hamaduli shoalgrass will hopefully come in to replace that. We just started our seagrass monitoring a few days ago, and so we're optimistic that the seagrass can recover as long as the clarity and water quality is good. So, and our data is on the water atlas, the transect data along with the mapping. So it's all that is there for the public to view as well. But yeah, thank you for that. And we'll try to stay optimistic.
Thanks, Wendy. Great comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Mindy was saying is we have some CHNEP seagrass pages specifically geared towards this now that are about to go live. We were just actually the AP staff provided their 2020 data, which we really appreciate. So that is now going to be on there as well as the water management district mapping data. And it's all going to be partnered together in one, by basin. So you can really look at the full picture together because we have these great groups collecting all of this great data and we want to be able to look at it together. As Mindy had said, you see those trends earlier and just from us being able to look at these graphics already, you can see those trends start a little bit earlier and, maybe we'll start to see the recovery as well in that transect data, hopefully. So anyway, we will let everyone know when those are live. We are just updating it with the 2020 data from both entities. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions once that goes up.
I have a question. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. It was really interesting to see all that data from such a broad area and the different trends in the different sub-basins. I saw a similar presentation recently by Tomasco related to the Sarasota Bay Area trends. And one of the points that he made was that the timing of some of these downward trends has been different in different bays or even in different portions of the same bay. And he was saying that an interesting challenge and next step in many cases is to attribute cause to some of these declines, which is, of course, a needed step into reversing them. And I just wondered if you had any ideas or insights into maybe some of the different timing of these trends. You mentioned the 2018 red tide and the hangover from that as being a cause of the decline in Charlotte Harbor. I noticed the decline in Lemon Bay seemed to start a little earlier than that in 2016. And I wondered if there'd been some change in conditions or management in that area that might help explain the earlier initiation of the decline there, or if there was any way that could be examined. Thanks.
Yeah, good questions. And really, that's the next step here is to really dig in here and look at those timings. Look at what's been driving them. It's complex, I would say that the timings are affected by several events, and in the case of Charlotte Harbor, the combination of Hurricane Irma and red tide coming straight after may have been significant there. The duration that the red tide was present for. And then of course there's issues with nutrient inflows from various sources in there. So it's yeah, all those things, yeah, again have an impact, and yeah, we going to take a bit, I guess, to tease that apart.
Hey, this is Mindy again. I guess I can jump in and say that we got funding to contract out some analysis to Janicki Environmental to look at our seagrass and the macroalgae abundance data throughout our aquatic preserves that are transect monitoring, as well as water quality data to perhaps see where there are any changes in water quality, nutrients, even land use that may have contributed to these areas where there have been seagrass loss or increase in macroalgae. So this project is supposed to be wrapping up by June 2022. So if we get any results from that, I'll be happy to share them.
Thanks, Mindy.
Any other questions? Well, thank you again, Mark. We really appreciate you coming in and presenting on that. Really interesting stuff, and I'm looking forward to seeing, hopefully we can get some more understanding of what the causes are behind the declines in seagrass coverages out there. So thank you again.
Thank you.